Hey, I'm Chanan Beizer, writer, creator of the Golem of Venice Beach. That's the first book. And we just completed our funding on Kickstarter for the second book. The complete story is books 1 and 2 will complete the story.
What's the elevator pitch on the book?
It's, oh man, I should have prepared for that one. Okay. It's a creature made by man trying to find his way in the world. Basically, that's it.
I like it.
It's sort of like Frankenstein, because people say that Mary Shelley was actually influenced by the legend of the Golem of Prague. It's a real legend. When she wrote her story Frankenstein, her novel. So the Golem story has been around since the 1500s, the legend. And I've updated it to be present day Venice Beach. But again, it's like man making a living being gets out of control and the repercussions have to be dealt with. That's Frankenstein, that's Terminator, that's RoboCop. You know, a lot of these stories have that we all know have basis in the legend of the Golem.
That's really cool. I didn't know any of that.
Now you know.
Yeah, I mean, I knew Mary Shelley wrote the original Frankenstein, but I didn't know that that's what it was based off of.
Well, she was influenced by it. I mean,
influenced.
People. That's what people say.
That's cool. What was the inspiration behind this?
Well, the real inspiration started when I moved from New York to Venice Beach, California. And I was just walking around, seeing the sights and sounds, and really being influenced by the unique area that it is. And I just wanted to set a story that takes place in that neighborhood. I thought it's a really cool neighborhood. And I started thinking, there's a lot of strange people that walk around Venice Beach, right? It's known for that. And I wanted to put a creature out of legend, fairy tale, legend, myth, whatever, living in and among the locals of Venice Beach. So that was the spark. And eventually eventually I thought about the legend of the golem. Now, in theory, most golems kind of look more like the Thing, right? Like made out of rock or stone or mud, especially the original Thing from the 1960s, kind of like more like a clay dripping mud kind of thing. But I wanted my golem to pass for human. So that was one of the changes that I made to the quotation marks real legend of the golem, is that he's very, very large, he's very, very strong, but he could pass for a regular person and not be a monster.
I like it. Is this your first comic book ever? I'm looking at your Kickstarter now.
This is my first comic book. It's a second Kickstarter, but my first complete comic book, let's say graphic novel, this one is. Originally, the idea that I talked about walking around Venice Beach and wanting to do something, originally started as a screenplay. I just finished up film school, and so it started as a screenplay, and after a while, it just wasn't clicking, and I just saw the long road of like trying to make a movie out of this thing, and I thought, well, okay, I can't make the movie right now, but I can make the comic book. And as it turns out, a large comic book being the graphic novel that I broke up into 2 books. So I had to relearn a whole bunch of stuff, like how do you write a comic book? I'd never written one before. So, you know, the whole process took a long time, but yeah, it's my first quotation marks comic book.
That is awesome. What are some of the things that you've learned now making your second graphic novel? From what's different from the first to the second? Well, did you change?
A lot of things just became streamlined. very lucky that the main artist for the first book agreed to come back for the second. And between the two books, her name is Vanessa Cardinali. She's from this small town in Italy. Between the two books, she did over 260 pages of art. So that's a lot. And so that was a big plus. So that's a big weight off my shoulders, because originally the big concern is that who am I going to get not only to do some of the smaller parts of the first graphic novel, but how am I going to get somebody to commit to do over 100 pages on my very first book? So that was a huge concern. So that was off my shoulders for the second book. And the other thing was that I knew that because of the editor that I had, Chris Stevens, and he did such a great job in getting all the other artists for the first book, I knew that I had a good shot of getting great artists to do some of the other things for the second book. And just my expectations of the process and the Kickstarter and my working with my editor, with the artists, everything I'd done before. So it was much easier, not easy, but easier to do it for the second book.
And Clover Press picked this up, didn't they?
Yeah, Clover Press did the first book, and it's also doing the second book. They're a quotation marks boutique publisher out of San Diego. Some of the people there originated in DC Comics and IDW. So they definitely know what they're doing. So that also helped a great deal, that I already had the publisher in place. I already had the main artist in place, and I knew that I could get other artists through my editor, Chris.
So did you fund this whole book yourself and then kickstart it to recoup some of the money and printing?
Pretty much. Yep. Pretty much.
So that means as soon as the Kickstarter's done, straight to printer and shipping, right?
Yeah, the Kickstarter funding period just ended, but people can still log on to Kickstarter and order the book through Kickstarter. We're not sending it off to the printer for a couple weeks, and hopefully it'll be in everybody's hands in May. But pretty much all the art is done, the lettering's done. We're just doing a few tweaks to the book design right now, but there should be no delays based on artist schedules or things like that. So, you never know what's going to happen in the world in terms of shipping delays, but the idea would be that it's going to be in people's hands, or at least sent out to people in May, book 2. And if you've never had either of the books, if you've never picked up the first one, you can still log on to the Kickstarter site and you can order both books if you're interested. Or you can get the hardcover copies, or you can get the digital copies.
Yeah, I seen the hardcover when you held it up with the beautiful spot UV on the front.
Yeah, and this is by Bill Sienkiewicz. And it's a wraparound cover by Bill Sienkiewicz, and he also did the first 7 pages of the book, the origin story in the 1600s, that tells the story of how the golem was created and put into suspended animation after it got out of control. Now the second book, this is a mock-up, okay? This is not. The final version is going to be a lot better, believe me. The second book, cover artist is Frank Quitely, and it's also a wraparound cover.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some blurbs over here, but it's a Frank Quitely cover. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of. The first book had 7 artists total. The second book has 10 artists total.
Why so many artists?
Well, the first book, I always had the idea of having 3 artists. I wanted the origin story, the creation of the golem back in the 16th century, and then it's put in suspended animation. I wanted the resurrection of the golem during World War II, and then the main story to take place in Venice Beach. So I always had the idea of 3 artists for the first book, different looks, different feels. And I always wanted to add a couple extras in the back of the book, so I wanted to do a map of Venice Beach. So by the way, the World War II stuff in the first book is by the great Jay Lee. Phenomenal art. This is just a little example, just a small example of his art.
I love his art. Some of the stuff he does for DC
Yeah.
and so, oh yeah.
And then he came back for the second book too. There's 10 pages of flashback in the first book about how the golem gets resurrected in the late 30s. And then there's a little bit of a finishing arc, 4 pages in the second book, that just puts that whole story of the World War II resurrection, completes the arc of that. So Jay Lee came back to finish that up for the second book. Now, going back to the first book, I wanted to do, as I mentioned, a map of Venice Beach, and that morphed into, this is just some prints, a Michael Allred kind of a visual graphic map of Venice Beach, which if you've ever been there, you'd recognize some of these things like Arnold Schwarzenegger mural and the skate park, and a bunch of stuff. So, and then I wanted a couple more extras. So we got the great Paul Pope to do a beautiful day at the beach with a Santa Monica Pier in the back. Got the classic, iconic Stephen R. Bissett, who did Swamp Thing, to do this kind of like visual horror stuff for the back. And then a newer artist, his name is Nick Pitara. He's got a great book out now called Axe Wielder John. He also did Manhattan projects for Image. Kind of like all the people, like I said, you never know who you're going to meet on the Venice Boardwalk, but here's an example of some of the people you might meet. So that ended up being 7 artists for the first book. Now for the second book, as I said, Vanessa came back and actually the second book is 184 pages. The first book was 152. So second book is even longer. So as I said, Vanessa did 260 pages between the 2 books. So she's back. That's 1 out of the 10. Jay Lee came back to finish up that World War II arc. So that's 2. Frank Whiteley did the cover. So that's 3. Now, we're not going to tell the origin story again, but I wanted 3 artists for this storyline as well. So there is a part of the book which is kind of like a vision quest, where a descendant of the man who created the golem 400 years ago needs to get in touch with his ancestors, let's say, to help the golem in present day. Because the golem is, if you can believe it, the golem is actually very much injured at a certain point. I mean, the way that I wrote it, the golem wasn't made to go up against modern machines and modern, killing. It was made to go up against swords and arrows, right, back in the 1600s. So it can be injured, and it was so injured it can't pass as human anymore. So this descendant has to go on a vision quest to try and heal the golem, let's say, to make it whole again. So he takes some ayahuasca, some salvia, some peyote, and he goes on a mind-bending vision quest. So that was a great opportunity to bring another artist in to do this great fantasy type stuff. And for that, we got David Mack, who did Kabuki and Daredevil. He created the character of Echo. So he did some, and this is just a printout, but he did some great like visuals.
Yeah.
So that's a 6-page vision quest. So that's 1, 2, 3 plus cover artist 4. All right. So there's still 6 more artists to go. I wanted, instead of doing bonus art like we did for the first book, which ended up being great, but my editor, Chris, had the idea of doing a bonus story, a complete story. So I came up with a concept of, since the golem is over 400 years old and is basically immortal, I had the question in my head, what if he'd never been put to sleep in suspended animation back in the 16th century? What if was he walking around the world for 400 years? Would he be in the same place? Would he leave? Would he see the whole world? He never ages. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't drink. He doesn't eat. He doesn't age. So what would he be doing? So I came up with a concept of like the passing time and like the old Marvel comic book, What If, you know?
Yep.
So I started thinking about that. So in terms of the passage of time, I came up with the idea of like, where would he be in winter 1725? Where would he be in spring 1852? You know, just like, where would he be? Spring, winter, spring, summer, fall in different centuries. So that really lent itself to 4 different artists for each one: winter, spring, summer, fall. And I needed something to like bring it all together, a framing story. So in total, that is 5 artists. So we got Dean Haspel, who's out of Brooklyn in New York, and he's got a couple comic book and characters, COVID Cop and the Red Hook. So got a concept for him to do the framing story, which is really, really nice. It's also influenced by the Lewis Carroll Through the Looking Glass. So it's kind of like What If plus Lewis Carroll. So Dean did that, and he does a total of 5 pages of the framing story. Then we settled on like near St. Petersburg in Russia, and this ends up being Howard Chaykin. If you know Howard Chaykin, he did the first issues of the Marvel comic book Star Wars, the first one, like back in the 70s. And he also did a great comic book series, part of the independent comic book publishers that was everywhere in the 80s. It was called American Flag. And it was a great comic book character, great comic book, kind of like reinvented the characterization of comic book characters in the normal comic book way of telling them, but he reinvented it. So we got him to do that. We got the great Stan Sakai of Usagi Yojimbo fame to do like the Golem ends up in Japan in 1783, and he's actually a caretaker at a rabbit shrine. So we got a little shout out to Usagi Yojimbo because he's taking care of rabbits in Japan. And then another great concept, what I think, was the old Wild West in America, because the Golem's moving east. He was in Prague, the Czech Republic, and he's moving east. He was in Russia, then he's in Japan. Now he's in Texas. And we got a great artist who's done Wolverine and Zombiotes, and he's doing some great stuff right now, Juan Jose Rip. He's doing like the Golem is a wrangler in the old Wild West, El Paso territory, wrangling a longhorn steer, which no human could do, but the Golem can do it. And then if he keeps moving east, he's going to end up in New York, right? So we got this great concept, and this is by actually one of the hottest artists out there right now. He's got this Absolute Batman out right now. So Nick Dragotta, everybody's talking about Absolute Batman.
Yeah.
Him and Scott Snyder, right? So luckily we got him before that was announced. And I just thought it'd be cool if the Golem ended up in New York, and he's working as a bouncer at CBGB in 1982. And that's the Beastie Boys playing there in the background. So this is like the what if. Where would the Golem be over the centuries? So I thought it was a really fun way for different artists to depict it, different time periods. And the Golem never changes. He doesn't age and so forth. So I thought that was really fun. So it's a bonus story.
This book sounds really cool. Like what you have here is very unique, different, and exciting all at the same time. Like,
yeah, and I don't want to leave it out because that's 9 artists. There's 1 artist left. So I'm a big fan of those classic Bronze Age comic books, right? So there was a great comic book, Avengers versus Defenders. It was when the Defenders comic book first came out in the early 70s, 1973, I believe. And they did a crossover between the 2 groups. So it was a 6-issue crossover 3 issues of the Avengers, 3 issues of the new comic book series, The Defenders. So you got Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, and so forth from that classic Avengers lineup, going up against Doctor Strange, the Hulk, Silver Surfer, and Namor, the classic original lineup of the Defenders. And there's this great pinup page by the great Sal Buscema, brother of John Buscema, which shows Thor and the Hulk clashing. And they're just holding each other and not moving an inch for hours. So, I mean, it's one panel, but in theory, they're just standing there for hours. And I loved that panel. And I wanted to put my Golem as a stand-in for the Hulk, because the Golem always wears his green army jacket. So I figured the green, and they're about the same size and so forth, going up against a new character introduced in book 2 that he clashes with. I call the character the Lady of the Dead. She kind of like a large, skeletal, winged angel of death. So I wanted to do an homage to that great pinup. And we got this great artist whose name is Das Pastoris. He's done some work with the Humanoids books, Casteka. He also did some of that art on that Nick Pitara book, Axe Wielder John. So this is exact duplication of the body language of the Golem versus the Angel of Death, Lady of the Dead, as Hulk versus Thor. And we're using, the artist's name is Das Pastoris, and my letterer and also book designer, Ferran Delgado, had a wonderful idea of using these old 1970s style graphics. So it's a real homage. And then we also show another panel, which is a duplication of the panel from the comic book from the 70s as well. And there's the original Hulk versus Thor, and there's a little doodle of Sal Buscema. So that's the total of the 10 artists in book 2.
Hell yeah. What social medias are you on?
Instagram mostly. I mean, I do have a presence on Facebook and Twitter, but on a day-to-day thing, I'm on Instagram. So it's just at the Golem of Venice Beach on Instagram. And that's where I keep people up to date on, like, for the past 3 weeks, I've been posting every day about the Kickstarter campaign and so forth. But like if I'm going to a con or the book is available in your local comic book shop, that's where I post stuff mostly.
Okay. Is there anything you want to say before we go?
No, just that I think it's a really good story, and I know that people will appreciate the fantastic art that's in it. I can't even count the number of Eisner Award winners between the 2 books. I don't know if we're up to 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm not even sure at this point. So many Eisner Award winners that are involved in this in terms of their art. The art is really, I think it's a unique book, telling this story of a legend, bringing it up into present-day Venice Beach. And, give it a shot. If you never picked up book 1, that's a great opportunity to pick up both books on Kickstarter right now. Even though the funding's over, you can still order the book. And if you did pick up book 1, I think you'll be very happy with the way the story wraps up in book 2. So that's about it.
Appreciate you taking the time to come talk with me.
All right. Thanks a lot.
What? You mean you haven't subscribed to Comicchatauthority? Oh, come on. Subscribe already. What are you waiting for? It's no big deal. Like, man, don't forget to tell him to hit that like button. Yeah, that too. Just subscribe.